And now we will visit the home of Erikson co-founder Barbara T. Bowman, a living legend in the early care and education field. Barbara is reflecting on the podcast project with Natalie Moore.
Thank you, Cassandra.
Barbara, why is it important to tell the story of the field and Erikson's contributions?
Well, Erikson's contribution has been significant. And it's significant, I think, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think we identified the right variables that affect how we educate professionals to work with young children and their families. And it's important to get that information out, that it was important 50 years ago. It's still important that we spend time and effort figuring out what's the best way to educate professionals so they can do the best possible job. I think it's also important that we learn something from our past. We've been through some of these stressful times before, and we've made good responses, like during the war. We've also made some not so good responses when we've cut programs and made it more difficult for families to survive. So I think that going over some of those past experiences and seeing what can be learned from them is a very useful thing. And then I think the field doesn't really understand itself. What does it consist of? Who's in it, and how long have they been in it, and what do they do? And I think because Erikson looks at professionalism as much broader than just teacher education, we've been able to concentrate what it is that all professionals need to know about kids and families. And then how does that apply to particular groups of kids and families, individuals and families? So what we've learned is something that everybody in the field needs to know about. And so I think those are some of the reasons why it's important to talk about the field and Erikson's role in it.
I've learned so much spending time with you. I've loved hearing your own stories as being a nursery school student and those memories being very clear for you, as well as learning about the field and how it's been regarded, how it's not been regarded. So I don't think that you have learned anything. I'm the one who's learning.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know what you were thinking when you came, first of all, to ask about early childhood education and the kinds of programs we have. Did you have a specific in mind? Did your child go to a particular kind of program?
Yeah, I have had interest because I now have a kindergartner, and she was doing a home-based preschool ever since she was 2. And I was very deliberate in what I wanted. I didn't want her doing memorization to get into, a high-performing public school. I wanted her to play. I wanted her to know empathy. I listened to people who were in the industry and didn't, friends, and didn't say she has to read by this age. But it's raised questions for me about affordability, access. I think there's a whole lot of research that needs to be done on home-based preschools. I think that I had a great one because she had a degree and the kind of curriculum that she did, but there are so many that I passed, and I wonder, you and I've talked a lot about childcare versus early childhood
Education.
Right.
Yeah, and I wonder if you think at all about your contribution to what she learned. You give your children permission to learn in different places. And one of the things we sometimes forget is that if the families don't trust you, if the families don't think that you're doing a good job, children are less likely to learn what's being presented than if they go to school with the notion that Mrs. Smith is exactly what my mother would say you have to do. So the reinforcement of family and role of family in the education of young children, I think is one of the things we've been skimpy about in most teacher education programs. We focused on the child, but we haven't focused on how what families do affect what children learn in school.
We were just talking about people trying to get into high school and how that's worse than college, but I'm saying people trying to get their kids into kindergarten and what does early childhood mean? And I just saw on Facebook yesterday, and it's all this middle class angst. Someone saying, "What do I have to do to prepare my child?" And all these parents are saying, all these apps, all these worksheets. But there were early childhood educators who said, "Don't do any of that. Let your kid play and read to them at night."
Well, it's a good thing to do if you're doing what we call the informal curricula in between times. If when you are talking to your child and doing your cooking, you're talking about numbers and you're adding to the vocabulary about boiling and frying and sauteing, it makes a big difference than if while you're cooking, you're saying, go look at television. There are 5 kids in the kitchen and I can't cook dinner with 5 kids in the kitchen. So depending on how much time families have, depending on what their interests are. Many people are not particularly interested in school-related skills and knowledge. They don't spend time helping their child understand different words, different numbers, different ways of looking at the world. So it's easy to forget that there's much about the education of your children that you're just doing automatically because you are educated. And how do we then help children who come from less educated families, who come from families who either are overwhelmed or too busy to give that kind of education? How do we help them learn what they need to know to be school successful? So think about your daughter, and then think about a child who comes from a family of 5 and a mother on minimum wage, and how different it might be in terms of what they're learning.
Yeah, and that was some of the feedback. Make learning just a part of your life
Yeah,
in the car, just living.
that's right. And you do it automatically because it's part of your life. But when it's not part of your life, when you have to do it intentionally, when you don't really have time to read every night because you have other things. You've got sewing and cooking and laundry and ironing and whatnot. You don't have time to sit and read a story every night. Um, how do you, just getting kids bathed may be the limit of what you can manage.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we duplicate what you're giving at home and school to the family that needs to get it at school?
What makes Erikson a good catalyst for this podcast project?
Well, I think we're willing to be looked at and to criticize ourselves, so that when we've talked about what we do at Erikson, it's generally not cut in stone, but how we change as we have grown older and learn more. I think that our history of providing the quality of education that has led to leadership. Our students are very often in leadership positions. They're recognized by employers as being more broadly educated than many people are who've been through programs similar. This is true both for our social work students and for our education students, our child development students. They each have had a baseline of child development, but they've learned to apply it in a variety of different ways. And I think being cross-fertilized as professionals has been very valuable for them.
What do you want listeners to take away from this project?
I guess the basic principles of our educational program and why it's successful, some understanding of the necessity of institutions to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the better ideas that have carried it into the present. So you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, But the advice we used to give, that it's just fine for kids to play all day and use self-choice, isn't as useful today for many children as it used to be. So when we didn't ask children to read in kindergarten, you didn't need to know the names of the letters. Now, no matter what group you come from, when you go to kindergarten, they're going to start you reading. You need to know the names of letters and the sounds that they make. So we've changed what we teach because the context in which children are being raised has changed. People are having fewer children and having them later. They are spending more time with their children. Everybody seems to be spending more time with their children. What implications does that have for what kids are learning or should learn? We find children under a lot of pressure. What kind of pressure are we able to relieve, and what kind of pressure can you not do anything about? The pandemic is the pandemic. You can't do anything that's going to shorten it except get inoculated. But we can, by how we present it to children, make it less of a risk factor. And there was some nice studies that were done during the war about what happened to children who stayed in the bombed out London with their parents, as opposed to going to the countryside without their parents and with strangers. And the children who lived in the city did better afterwards than the kids who went to the country. So understanding things like that in child development, that child development is relevant, and that we need to be using it and thinking about it. That doesn't mean that all kids that stay in bombed out shelters are going to do better than kids who live in the country. But it does say we have to think a little bit more carefully about things. And I think Erikson's notion of reflection and thinking about what are the contexts in which children live, as well as what are the developmental pushes that drive us and drive learning. I think both of those things are attributes of Erikson that the field needs to understand.
Thank you, Barbara.